What? Thank you, Mickey Delp. Thank you, Nerd Nite. Thank you, Vigilante. I was disturbed, maybe appalled, by the smooth and fluent delivery of the previous speaker, who was speaking without notes, in a rapid, clear, crisp fashion. And I assure you that what you are about to hear will be spastic, perhaps even Tourettic, and make extensive use of notes. Ladies and gentlemen, what is Midway? Well, that's Midway. Midway is an atoll. What is an atoll? I have no idea. I think it has something to do with coral reef. But it is a tiny, tiny place in the middle of nowhere. It is a 2.5 square mile area for the entire atoll, including most of which, in fact, is underwater. It is about the size, or I should say half the size of LAX airport. It is also, interestingly, possibly the most remote place on the entire planet. You may have heard that the Hawaiian Islands are the most remote part of the world, the most remote island group on Earth. Well, Midway is the tiny, remote, extreme easternmost of the Hawaiian Islands. It's so small, in fact, that it is technically part of the Hawaiian Islands, and yet is not part of the state of Hawaii. They just said, we don't really need you. But anyway, I think you get a sense from this view of the world, and not a view we see all the time, of just how big the Pacific Ocean is. I mean, it's a vast place, and so you have to imagine a place that is just surrounded by the Pacific Ocean, and yet, Midway happens to have been the location of the most consequential naval battle in all of human history, with the possible exceptions of the Battle of Salamis and Trafalgar. But really, this is World War II we're talking about. And let's face it, World War II was a big deal. World War II was by far the largest and deadliest conflict in human history. World War II involved the vast majority of human societies, of nations, and it was a deadly thing, right? It involved an estimated 70 to 85 million fatalities. That's a number, I think really it's safe to say that is a number that is beyond human comprehension. I mean, what does it mean when I say that 85 million people were killed in this war? It's just unfathomable. It's just like it's just a data point. It has no human reality to it, and yet that was the case. And this, of course, is the less famous, less interesting to some people part of the war, the Pacific War that took up so much of the world. And how did it begin? Well, it began with a dilemma, the Japanese dilemma. You see, the Japanese lived in a country that was very modern, very advanced, sophisticated, and yet it had serious problems, okay? Wealthy, ambitious, and desperate. Desperate because it is sick of being treated as a second-class power by Europe, by the United States, especially when the post-World War I era came around, and Woodrow Wilson, who was a real racist asshole, treated Japan very, very badly after that war. And so they don't like that too much, but also they have a much more material significant problem, which is the country is overpopulated and is not able to feed itself. The nature of the physical geography of Japan is such that there is not enough arable land for the Japanese nation to feed its own burgeoning population. And so what are they doing to try and mitigate this fact? Well, one of the things is they are emigrating, okay? And where are they going to offload this excess population so that it doesn't starve to death? Largely to the Pacific states of the United States. And what does the United States do in consequence? Well, they enact racist laws that say the Japanese cannot emigrate to the United States. And so this effectively cuts off a safety valve for the Japanese. It says, you cannot remove this excess population to a place where they can feed themselves, and you won't have to feed them. You must keep your population in its entirety. So, this is what happens to Japan. Japan, in its desperation, and for ideological reasons as well, invades China. It conquers Manchuria, creates the puppet state of Manchukuo, and then in 1937, Japan invades China more generally. And FDR, as it so happens, is a Sinophile. He loves China. He loves the Chinese people. And he regards this invasion, which is, after all, rather a brutal invasion and occupation, he regards it as an affront, a personal affront. And he says, okay, we are going to raise a series of embargoes against Japan. We are going to cut off your raw material supply, and particularly, we're going to cut off your oil supply. So Japan says, we have no way to get raw materials. We have no way to get oil. We cannot offload our excess population. What we're going to do is we're going to conquer much of the world. We are going to conquer Indonesia, what is now Indonesia. We are going to conquer the Philippines, New Guinea, Sumatra, the rest of China. We're going to conquer Indochina, which will later be known as Vietnam, and the surrounding countries. And we will unite these territories as an Asian co-prosperity sphere that will banish European colonialism from Asia. So all these countries that we're talking about were protectorates or territories or colonies of European countries. And Japan says, no more. We are going to liberate these countries. Unfortunately, the liberation proves to be rather vicious occupation also. So it goes to show you that taking colonies is not always a pleasant business. In any case, the problem that stands in the way of Japan and its ability to do this, to put into effect its co-prosperity sphere, is that Britain and especially the United States are powerful forces in the Pacific. Britain has many territories, including Singapore, many important bases, and the United States, of course, has Pearl Harbor and Hawaii, its naval command, its impressive fleet. And so the Japanese realize that if they're going to put their plan into effect, this desperate plan to conquer all this territory, they are going to have to attack the US and Britain. Famously on December 7th, 1941, they bomb Pearl Harbor. They destroy most of the American Pacific Fleet in a single day, in one of the most effective sneak attacks in the history of warfare. And in the days that follow, Japan does not simply attack Pearl Harbor, but attacks many territories almost simultaneously. They lay siege to the Philippines. They lay siege to Australia. They lay siege to Borneo, Burma, Hong Kong, all of these other territories. They kick the living shit out of us. Okay, when I say us, I'm referring to the United States. They do incredibly well, in other words. So as the months lead up to the Battle of Midway, we have a situation where the Japanese have conquered 1/3 of the Pacific Ocean. They have driven the Americans back everywhere the Americans have tried to resist. They have driven the Americans out of the Philippines, humiliating MacArthur and FDR. They have sunk American battleships. They've sunk American carriers, in fact. And you may have heard that one of the serendipitous events of the Pearl Harbor attack was that there were no U.S. aircraft carriers there. And this is what transformed naval warfare largely. No one knew up before World War II that the aircraft carrier was going to become the central part of every fleet, that it was going to be aircraft carriers that would become the most important military weapons in naval warfare. But that's what happened as a result. In any case, it's been a hideous situation from the American point of view. The Americans have only been able to strike one blow back, and that was the Doolittle raid, perhaps unfortunately named, but that was the guy's name, Doolittle, who ordered the thing. And so, yeah, this magnificent act of resistance is forever known as the Doolittle raid. It was a bombing of Tokyo that, in fact, terrified the Japanese, though it did very little damage and was of very little military consequence. Anyway, the Americans are on the ropes. And the Japanese, nevertheless, must get the U.S. to the negotiating table quickly, okay? Because Japan's industrial power is very, very small compared to the U.S. industrial power. The industrial power, and this translates into weaponry. This translates into the ability to build more aircraft carriers and more battleships. Japan realizes that if it does not act decisively and quickly, force the U.S. to surrender effectively, it will soon face a huge arsenal of aircraft carriers on the part of the U.S. And it won't be able to stop them anymore. So instead, it decides to do yet another sneak attack, this time at the Battle of Midway. How did the U.S. find out about the Midway attack? Well, there was a gentleman named Captain Rochefort. That's him, a great eccentric, man who would walk around the headquarters in his bathrobe and slippers, fuzzy slippers, a man who openly discussed the fact that he had been driven insane by dealing with cryptography, the study of codes and how to crack them. He commanded the U.S. Navy Combat Intelligence Unit in the Pacific, the AKA Station Hypo. And by April 1942, they had cracked the Japanese code with reasonable effectiveness. He learns that the Japanese are planning a trap for the Americans. They will attack a location, according to transmitted messages, called AF, codenamed AF. The Americans think this might be Midway, but they cannot be sure. Rochefort's ruse, he has the Americans go on the radio and send out a fake distress call claiming that Midway is running out of water. Then they listen, and sure enough, the Japanese send out a radio transmission of their own saying AF is running out of water. And so, when the Japanese, under the plan of Yamamoto, who is the genius behind Pearl Harbor, decide to go to Midway and attack those airfields there, the U.S. is ready and waiting. But of course, ready and waiting is a relative term. The U.S. only has 3 aircraft carriers. The Japanese are sending 4 aircraft carriers to Midway. So this is the great plan of the U.S. to surprise and ambush these 4 aircraft carriers with 3 aircraft carriers. The Americans do have the advantage of surprise. They do have the advantage of having radar, which the Japanese do not yet possess. And yet, it is a simple fact that every time they have fought the Japanese, they have gotten their asses kicked. So here are the ships involved. The main ones, the Atagi, the Kaga, the Hiryu, and the Soryu, versus the USS Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown, and all of their supporting ships, all of their airplanes, okay? They're thousands and thousands of personnel. So how does this battle begin? Well, basically, the America is losing the war to a more experienced, better equipped, better trained Japanese military. The Americans are outmatched 3 carriers to 4, and despite their advantage, they face long odds. The Japanese begin a 6-hour phase. I did warn you about my spasticness. The first 6 hours of the Battle of Midway begin as the Japanese launch their fighters, their bombers, to attack the airfields on the Midway Atoll, okay? They go down there and start bombing the living hell out of it. The American torpedo bombers fly out of Midway and attack the Japanese aircraft carriers. Wave after wave of American torpedo bombers swarming and attacking these aircraft carriers. What must it have been like to be the pilot of one of these torpedo bombers? Well, it's a unique position to be in, because the disposition of a torpedo bomber is that it must basically fly at the level of the waves, okay? And it's going to have cannon flying, shooting at them head on, no matter what direction that takes of approach. So you imagine flying into a hail of lead, and you have the best trained, best equipped fighter pilots in the world, the Japanese pilots who fly the Japanese Zeros, which are not armored planes, but are fast, maneuverable, and expertly handled. And so you have these guys flying along straight towards these aircraft carriers, and they are just massacred. They are wiped out, wave after wave, suffering 95% casualties. And though they don't know it, they are sacrificing themselves more or less in vain, because the torpedoes that they do launch, that they do drop, and that do make contact with the enemy ships are defective. This is one of the dirty secrets of the American Navy in this part of the war. We have worthless torpedoes that almost never go off. And of course, this information was kept classified, so we didn't know for decades after the war that this was the case. If you read old accounts of these battles, it's all just talking about how somehow they keep missing. They missed. Well, he fired his torpedo and it missed. No, that was not it. So, this is the 6 hours. The 6 hours between 4 o'clock in the morning or so and 10 o'clock in the morning. Then this is the culmination of the war so far, right? I mean, you have this wave after wave crashing and burning, going up against the Japanese super fortresses and being destroyed. And despite, the U.S. has failed continuously and is continuing to fail to resist the Japanese. Now the U.S. fleet, her vital carriers that have been by luck survived Pearl Harbor, is in danger of being finished off. Japan will then consolidate her gains in the Pacific nations she's occupied. She will dig in all of these places like New Zealand, and I mean, not New Zealand, New Guinea and Sumatra and Indochina and elsewhere. And by the time the U.S. can get back on her heels, it will probably be too late. And then the 15 minutes begins. That happens to be my 15-minute mark. The dauntless dive bombers launched off of these American aircraft carriers arrive at their targets, the Japanese carriers, at 10:14 a.m. and score their first hit at 10:22 a.m. What is it like to be the pilot of a dauntless dive bomber at the Battle of Midway? Well, the dauntless dive bombers start at an altitude of 14,000 feet. Then, and at this point, the aircraft carrier was about the size of a matchbox car from the point of view of the pilot. Now, who has been on a plane that would hit turbulence? Or been on a roller coaster? Now, the thing about turbulence or a roller coaster is even at that most perilous first drop-off of the roller coaster, you're actually quite safe. Your chances of being harmed are very, very low. Here, the opposite is the case. The plane goes into an almost perfect 90-degree dive, straight down, nose down against an aircraft carrier that is firing everything it has up at you. Meanwhile, the Zeros are swarming around trying to shoot you down. You are in that situation, as in a turbulence on a plane, as on a roller coaster, where whatever you may be going through your mind, however well prepared you may feel you are, your body is in a situation where the dynamics, the physical forces at work are so far outside of the scope of what a human body is designed to deal with that you have this intense, almost unreality of anxiety and terror. And sure enough, this is what happens. These dive bombers dive down onto the aircraft carriers, and in 15 minutes, aiming for the red rising sun circle on the wooden decks of these carriers, in 15 minutes, they destroy 3 of the 4 carriers of the Japanese. And it'll take the rest of the day for the Americans to destroy the 4th and final carrier. And in the process, of course, both sides will lose hundreds of ships, airplanes, and thousands of personnel. But to illustrate truly how decisive this is difficult. This is a war that the Americans were losing badly. And now, well, if you've ever played chess, you understand the importance of material. You don't win a game of chess by having more material. You win a game of chess by checkmating your opponent. But if you have a lot more material than your opponent, if you have much more pieces and more important pieces than your opponent, gradually it becomes easier for you to win, and it has a snowballing effect so that your situation becomes helpless. This is the loss of 4 carriers for the Japanese. It is like the loss of both rooks and a queen. So the fight will go on. It will go on for another 3 years. But Japan's position has become hopeless. It cannot win the war. And so this is why we say that this was the most consequential battle since the Battle of Salamis in ancient Greece, and one of the turning points of human history. Thank you.
All right, thank you. You want to take some questions?
Sure.
All right, do we have any? Who has a question for LB? Yes.
World War II was such a technological inflection point. So where did this lie within, let's say, like all the cryptography and all like the stuff that Bell Labs was doing, and like how was it all related?
That's a great question. What was the role of the advance of information technology, the state of such technology in this war and its interplay with the war? I think that you can say that the information and its rise, information technology and its rise, the study of information as a science, was hugely important in the cryptological efforts of the Allies, but that was mostly in Europe with Alan Turing and Bletchley Park. What you had in Hawaii with the hypo station, you have some good old-fashioned hard work. I mean, the brilliant mathematical minds working around the clock. But after all, these code breakers were mostly members of the Navy band. They had been plucked out of the band because they figured we don't need a band very much, we need code breakers, and maybe their musical ability will translate to an ability to detect patterns, okay? So you have some very, very highly trained, brilliant officers leading them, but these guys who are doing the code breaking are largely, well, playing the glockenspiel and things like that.
That's a great story. Yes.
So forgive me for being a little speculative or asking you to be, but what might have happened if Japan won the Battle of Midway?
Japan, if it had won the Battle of Midway, might very well have lost the war anyway. I mean, a lot of people look at the Japanese situation and say it was a doomed situation. But I find that hard to believe. I think that when you consider the vast territories seized by Japan during this time period, the relative defenselessness of the native peoples of these territories, especially in Southeast Asia, it seems very likely to me that they would have been able to hold on to these territories and might have had them for decades to come. They wouldn't have defeated the U.S., right, in an important way. They certainly weren't going to, despite what you see in the movies, they weren't going to go occupy California or something, you know. That was not going to happen. But they might have accomplished their goal, this co-prosperity sphere. They might have really done that. And yeah, so it was a big deal.
You showed all those the aircraft carrier, the surface craft. That's a large support structure. Was there any effort to actually take out the Japanese ability to support themselves in their activity, not just their combat craft, like fuel handling, food, logistics? That's what I'm asking about.
Well, I think that the main effort to take out the ability of the Japanese to power their machines and support themselves was not really during the war. It was one of the causes of the war with these oil embargoes and raw materials embargoes. I mean, when FDR sees Japan invading China and occupying China and killing lots of people, he says, well, we're going to stop them from doing this. How? By not selling them any more oil, and they get almost all their oil from the U.S. So that was the attempt to do this. Unfortunately for the U.S., the Japanese, in their quick acquisitions of places like then Dutch, whatever it was called, I forget it, but it was Indonesia, they immediately seized the oil fields of all these places, and now they have no problem with raw materials. They have no problem with oil at all, and their only problem is the U.S.
All right, we're gonna do one more.
What was the Greek one, the Battle of Salamis? What is that?
Well, there might be a little Western prejudice in saying that the Battle of Salamis was as consequential as we sometimes do. I think you'd make a counter argument that it wouldn't have made all that much difference. But the conventional Western view of the Battle of Salamis is this, that the Persians are invading Greece. You remember the Battle of Marathon. You remember all these Thermopylae, these famous battles as Persia lays siege to Greece. And Salamis was the decisive defeat of the Persians that drives the Persians away. And the reason people regard it as so critical is because the idea is, well, otherwise, if the Greeks hadn't defended themselves, the Persians would have swamped over and occupied Greece, and there would have been no ancient Greece. And if there's no ancient Greece, well, what happens to democracy? What happens to philosophy? All these things are the central building blocks of Western civilization. And so, yeah, people treat the Battle of Salamis as a very, very important victory for the West, rightly or wrongly.
All right, I think we're good. All right, we're gonna do one more. Last question. Better be good too. It's good.
I was just curious. It seems like the United States was losing to Japan so handily, as you were talking about. Strategically, when these planes were bombing, like dive bombing these carriers, do you know, was that intentional or was it an accidental effort that led to the victory? I mean, do you understand what I'm saying? Was it planned?
Yeah, one of the many things I had to gloss over in order to discuss this battle in a brief time period was what the Japanese were up to during this whole battle. I mean, the Japanese, yes, they attacked Midway, but they were also attacking the American aircraft carriers. They destroyed and almost sunk the USS Yorktown, and they used the same tactics we were using. The basic battle line tactics of this war are send in torpedo planes, and then send in dive bombers. And sure enough, those dive bombers of the Japanese hit the Yorktown and damn near sunk her. And so that's what we were doing was planned. The only thing that wasn't planned was that our torpedoes didn't work, and that those torpedo planes were lost seemingly for no reason. And even that's an oversimplification. The truth is that the whole time the torpedo planes are attacking the Japanese carriers, the carriers are unable to launch an attack. Okay, they cannot launch a fighter or bomber wing while the torpedo planes are flying at them. They have to defend themselves, and so it does have a big consequence. It's just that it didn't actually hurt anyone. No, not a hair on a single Japanese sailor or pilot's head was hurt by any of these torpedo planes.
All right, fascinating. Thank you so much, LB. Another round of applause.